Welcome back. Take Control of Your Life podcast this week. So we've been out for a while, but got a very special guest. We got Nick Kyle from Move Right Physical Therapy. Nick, I reached out to you because we had you in here for a little bit. The space just didn't quite work out, but You're bringing Move Right back to Fairmont, and I am very excited because I love the process that you follow at Move Right and what your team does. So can you give us an overview of Move Right's approach to physical therapy and all the things you do with Move Right?
Yeah, man. I think overviews is tough, right? I tend to say 15 words when only 5 are needed. But the basis of how we're going to approach physical therapy is we look at physical therapy and strength conditioning as being the same thing. It all comes down to where are you entering that spectrum as to how do we intervene with it. And so the point behind that is that things like CrossFit, things like powerlifting, strongman, fill in your blank. I don't care what your methodology is for what you're going to do. There's expansibility to that. There's some way that we can take a barbell at 15 pounds, like one of your training bars, and we can load that with plates. And so it can go from 15 pounds up to 300 pounds. And so like the spectrum of how we're actually going after movement patterning is really the key. So instead of looking at things in this very minute, isolated way, so kind of what we were talking about before, we can look at you and say like, you had work on your knee, so we're going to work on your quad. Like, how do we strengthen a quad? Well, we can do long arc quads. We can do some things like that. Or we can say this movement pattern of knee flexion, knee extension is limited. What can we do to load knee extension pattern? And so then we can change from, okay, well, I need to strengthen this one muscle to how does this entire pattern work together? And what we find with that is that so many times we have limitations within, even, post-surgically, we have a site that is a problem, but everything around that site is also going to have to be dealt with. So the hip is going to have to be addressed. The ankle is going to have to be addressed. How are you carrying your spine? How are you maintaining tensile strength through your trunk when you're doing day-to-day activity or when you're in your movement training process? So I guess that is, again, I've managed to talk way too much on this, but the idea is patterns, not parts. So we're looking at movement with a big M rather than movements with a little m. I'm not interested in your movements. I'm interested in how do you move as a functioning human system.
So if we're looking at breaking that down for a listener, we have, I want to say over a dozen PT clinics in this area. There's a good bit.
A lot.
And I was just talking to you beforehand. From what I see, it almost seems like someone comes in with X and they go to their book and they say, well, this is the program for X. And when I've worked with you, we come in, your assessment process, from what I see, what's causing the pain, what caused it, what's currently causing it. Okay, now let's try to fix it, and then you adjust the program if needed.
Right.
And
right. Try to integrate back to what you're already doing. That's my goal. Is not, I don't need you to have, like, let's think about your week, right? You're training in the class. I assume you're doing some of the class WODs. I know before you were doing a lot of accessory work as well, like you're doing your own strength stuff, doing a mobility program, you're coaching jiu-jitsu, you're a dad. So you've got a lot of hours already spoken for, right? So what good does it do me if I provide you now another program? You're going to do another hour of PT work before you're going to be able to do your strength work, or before you're going to be able to do your class WODs, before you're going to do jiu-jitsu. We've just stacked a whole lot more stuff into what you're already doing. Or can I just take the movements you're already utilizing and let's say, okay, let's take your deadlift and let's do it like this instead. Let's tweak this one position just a little bit, or let's add this one primer before you hit that movement so that your body is most ready, or your nervous system is most ready to accept those positions, and then we can load them and utilize them. If we provide an education on how to take what you're already doing and tweak it to fit what your rehab should look like, we just built in this entire movement set that it's easy for me, it's easy for you. We don't have to find a bunch of extra time. You're already doing it. Like that's thorough, you know?
So I think that's a great point. I'm pretty active. I would say I'm outside of the normal human.
For so many reasons.
Right. So when we're looking at that, and I was going to you, we were looking at movements that I was dealing with some hamstring tendonitis and some rotator cuff issues. So we were looking at the mechanics behind the movement, and is it as simple as I'm moving incorrectly? So you were able to take the movements that I was doing, we tightened them up, we looked at some other pieces that most people don't even realize, like, you know, what's your core bracing pattern when you're doing a deadlift? How can that actually tie into your hamstrings? But it does.
Right.
And so that's how you treated me as an individual. But if we're looking at another avatar, if you have someone who comes in with, Greg just had both knees replaced, and you were discussing, you might have saw him how many times? So I think
it's a broad statement, right? Like there's a lot of variability to that.
I think what I want to say on it is from my understanding, you guys treat humans like humans, adults like adults. Yep. And when you are very upfront, you say, hey, I don't want to waste your time or your money. I'm going to see you. I'm going to give you homework. I'm going to see you back, and I expect you to do the homework.
Yep.
Versus some other PT this is just a generalized thing.
It's a hand-holding model, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a hand-holder. And the way I always approach stuff is that I can't want this for you more than you want it for you. And I'm not going to invest myself beyond what you're going to invest yourself. So if I give you a couple things to do, and that's the other point that I guess I would want to push out there, is that a lot of the time when you go into PT, kind of what you alluded to, you're handed this packet of exercises. You might have 10 or 15 different things you're going to do. I might give you 2. You know, like we might have 1 or 2 things that we're going to utilize right now with the educational piece of, here's how I need this to go. Here's what I'm looking for out of these movements, and this is the timing on those. And if we can hit that, it decreases that onus of, like, you've got 15 different things to do. You got 1 or 2 basic tasks to take care of that will fit into your day. It fits with what you're already doing. That's probably the biggest take home for me, is that I'm all about how do we integrate to what you're already doing so that you can do it better. Whatever scale you're on with that, how do we get to where you're at and do it better for your system?
So let's cover that education piece, because this is something I talk about quite a bit. We live in West Virginia. We are number 1 in obesity. We are number 1 in type 2 diabetes. As of 2023, I think, was when I pulled these numbers. We were 47th in education and 49th in healthcare. And my personal opinion is those are going hand in hand. We are not educating our people enough. And it was something you said before we started the podcast, where can you maybe could you re-explain the healthcare model of medication versus physical exercise?
Yeah, that study we were kind of briefly talking about. And I don't remember the exact details of that, but I believe it was the 1960s. There was a study done that was paid for by the U.S. government that looked at prescription medication management for most musculoskeletal conditions versus exercise management for the same conditions. And what that came out of that study was that exercise intervention was as good or better for most musculoskeletal conditions than prescription medication management. And the U.S. government came back and said, well, that's fantastic, but I don't think the U.S. people will actually exercise. So we're going to back pharmaceutical managements. And so we see this constantly. Like, this is still coming around now. Like, the education on this stuff, the understanding of, type 2 diabetes is an interesting one. Like, there's outliers to everything, but at the same time, like, it is a highly manageable condition with basic movement, basic education on nutritions, and even after this condition has presented itself, it's still highly manageable or treatable, curable. I mean, curable is a real gray area to say, but it is definitely something that is extremely manageable with exercise interventions.
It's interesting. And in my market, I'm not allowed to say I can cure this.
Right.
But we've taken dozens of people in their first 2 months who had A1Cs of 7.5 to 10 and brought them down to a 5.
Yep.
But we overload education on the front end.
Yep.
And so if we're going back to the education side, that's one of the things I also loved working with you is I didn't just come in and you said, do this. You explain the why behind it.
Right.
And I always try to tell my coaches, if you give feedback to something and they ask why, we need to have an answer.
Yep. If you understand why you're doing something, so I talk about this whenever I go through evals with people, is that my underlying job or my underlying goal when you come in the door is that when you walk out, you understand why this symptom, why this pain, why the movement condition is present in the way that it is. If you can understand how things are interconnected, what you do to manage it becomes extremely simple. If you understand that my low back hurts when I do, when I go run or when I do a snatch or whenever I'm deadlifting, if we understand that, okay, well, the low back hurts, but your hip does not fully extend. If we can drive that so that you can see it, and I can highlight for you, your hip extension is lacking. If we can get your glutes to come through, if we can get your hamstrings to come through in that movement set, and we bring a little bit of cueing and education on that side, well, now everything that you do outside of that clinic, oh, okay, my back's bugging me. Is my hip working? Am I getting into that extended position or am I compromising it? If you understand why something is happening, how you manage it becomes extremely simple. And I think that's universally true for almost everything that we do, right? Like if you understand the why and have a point and purpose to it, everything becomes easy.
It's interesting you use that example because we had an athlete today doing step-ups, was resting. I said, hey, you okay? I got sciatica, my lower back starting to flare up. I said, let me watch you do a step-up. So he does it, and he's doing that deep lean.
Yeah, dipping forward.
And I said, I really want you to squeeze your butt throughout that entire press and as you're going down. First rep, he said it doesn't hurt.
Yep.
And again, going back to the education side, there was another piece that we discussed before starting the podcast was there is more education now than ever before. And we talked about the spectrum of it seems like either people get it or they don't.
Yeah.
There's not a ton of in between.
It's from my vantage, it's extremely disparate. Like the top end of our health and wellness is so high. Like the people who do it well really get it. I'm not talking about, the games athlete, right? Like that's not what I mean. I mean the people who are healthy, right? Like somebody who's taking care of their nutrition, somebody who's taking care of their training. They're well balanced across the spectrum. There's a lot of people who are doing that well. There's also a lot of people who are not doing that well and don't really have a good understanding of it or have not had the opportunity to be introduced to those things. And that, again, speaking to the educational side, I think that is a huge failure that we have within our education system is that, why are our kids not getting taught basic nutrition stuff? Like my daughters are in public school and they'll go and get breakfast at school. And I'm like, well, what did you eat? And like, well, we had Lucky Charms. Like, I understand it's easy, but like, do we have an opportunity to provide healthy options or even just an education of like, this is why you're eating this. This is what is in this. So, this is an energy producing unit and this is what you're going to do with it. Like these kids have an opportunity to learn. I'm not saying we have to change that. I mean, that's another conversation for another time, but there's opportunities given that are just not being taken. And unfortunately, in order for our healthcare system to change, these are the things that have to happen. Like we've got a 20 to 40 year problem of education that has to occur. And it's not going to be necessarily even my generation that's going to drive that forward. It's my kids and their kids that we can actually potentially see real change across the spectrum because that education level has to come from somewhere. And it's going to be a slow dissemination because people change habits very slowly typically. So it's going to take time.
Well, yeah, it's hard to change habits that are ingrained in us over 40 years.
Especially if you don't know.
Right. I think that's honestly from the onboarding process that we run when I do that nutrition lecture, probably 60% of people cannot tell me the 3 macronutrients that our body relies on. And then I might get 5% that even know what the 3 macronutrients actually do.
Right.
And so that's basics. I mean, that's like oil in your car.
Yep.
That's how simple it is.
Well, and how many people still will look at something and be like, oh, there's too much fat in that. Like, I'm going to look at this piece of cake and like, oh, that fat's a problem. Like, maybe it's the sugar. maybe that's the real issue here, right? Like the fat on a steak is not necessarily a problem. Like that's how we actually build hormones, right? But like, so my point in that is that there's education out there, but it's poor education, right? Like the understanding across the board, like from my parents' generation, where it was like, oh, well, butter's bad for you, so we're going to use margarine, this processed stuff that, you know, used to lubricate airplanes. That's a healthier option because there's less fat. Yet, if we look at the obesity rates, they skyrocketed when we started doing this stuff. And is that a one-to-one? Like maybe not. You know, maybe correlation is not causation, but there's certainly something there, right? There is a correlate. So the understanding across the board of like what is healthy, what is not healthy, what am I grabbing, and how does that impact, you know, from my standpoint as a physical therapist, like you had a knee replacement. If you're eating a ton of sugar and a ton of processed stuff, guess what that's going to do to your inflammatory process? Like that thing is never going to heal just because it's going to be angry and inflamed all the time. It makes pain levels much, much higher because it increases the sensitivity across the spectrum for everything you're going to do. So if we have tissue damage, it slows the process so much. And then if we overlay that and start talking about that from the diabetes standpoint, now we have brakes that have been put on to the healing process. So it's this compounding effect of what goes into your body is going to impact the tissue quality that we have underlying it.
I think it's interesting that this podcast on physical therapy has gone to the nutrition side, but that is a huge part of it. And what you just said, the overconsumption of sugar causes that inflammation response, right, and then it delays the healing process. I don't know if you can speak on it, but is that also part of what you do when someone comes in? They kind of look at the nutrition side of it too and explain these supplements or these macros will help the healing process faster?
In the right context, I'll do that. But to be frank, like I'm not good at that stuff. This is not my primary skill set. And if somebody needs the base education, more than happy to discuss it. I feel like I'm more than equipped to be able to talk about basics. But when it goes beyond the basics, when somebody really needs a lot of hand holding, there's other people who are going to be much, much better at that. So yes, in the context of exactly what I just said. Okay, you had this knee replacement. We need to be paying attention to these things. Is this thing angry, red, swollen all the time? Are we really slowing down the healing recovery process? If that's the case, hey, have you thought about these things? Have we looked at these factors as to, you know, what else is happening within your system? And there's people who are just so much better at that than I am. Like I understand the basics.
You can go a long way with the basics.
Yep.
I mean, honestly, we were talking about jiu-jitsu before. That's all I teach. Is I just do the basics, and they work really well across all levels. And you can get 90% of the way there with just the basics.
That's what I consider. That's what I do. That's my physical therapy practice is just basic. And like they make fun of me at the clinic all the time because pretty much everybody that comes through, I'll have the conversation, we'll go through the eval and be like, okay, look, it's just simple. It's just this, you know, and we break it down into one or two little things, but it's truly the foundational information. I feel like I don't want to go too far into the weeds because I know this isn't a physical therapy podcast, but so much of the time when students come out of physical therapy school, they feel that they have the basics down. And I think this is true for a lot of industries. They have the basics down, so now I need to go learn this next technique so that I'll get everybody better if I learn how to dry needle. I'll get everybody better if I learn how to use a Graston tool or whatever, fill in the blank for your technique. But the reality is that most of the time, you have the tools you need, you're just not good at using them. You need to refine how you're looking at things and understand that these basic movement concepts still apply. You just have to put them together in the right orders in the right way so that you can best address the individual sitting in front of you. You learn it in this broad spectrum, but basics can constantly be refined. From white belt to black belt, you're still looking at basic movement patterns. It's how you perceive those that change your approach.
That's an interesting take on it. I was teaching an armbar the other day, and we got 3 steps to a push climb pass armbar. But then when I broke it into 7 steps, everyone got it, and it's still basics. I mean, it's just slight angle changes. And that's something, when I was working with you, we were looking at the deadlift, and we were just looking at like moving my foot out 1/4 of an inch.
Yep.
Little things like that went a long way, and how we're creating pressure throughout the entire foot versus one of the things I think CrossFit gets wrong when we're talking about movement patterns is they always want to talk about weight in the heels.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand why that's a cue,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not necessarily how the squat should be done.
Yeah.
That's a small thing, but it can go a long way if we understand truly how to create pressure.
I think I see that as one of the things that I do almost every single day is coach squats in some capacity, and it is very rare that I have someone that has their weight too far forward. It is almost universally somebody who's had the high school weight room cue of get your weight in your heels, push out of the heels, light in the toes, that kind of thing. Like that seems to be a really common thing that is still present. I mean, so do we know where that came from? Like that cueing process? Like
I think it came from the fact that people were up on their toes. So this is where I explain it to the coaches. That is a cue to help if someone is squatting forward.
Yeah.
That's when we say weight in the heels. But that is not how that movement is applied.
Right.
And
it's the misappropriation of how a squat is actually to be utilized. A squat is a method of force dissipation. So I want to really harp on that because that's the crux of what a squat is. Everybody thinks it's about driving up out of the hole. It's not. It's about controlling the weight from the top down. So most of your other movements, like your deadlift, is purely concentric. It's one phase. So we focus on this concentric piece. But your squat has a really interesting ability for transferability of skill, especially within the CrossFit environment. Because if we are able to control the squat down, it will now carry over to your box jump, to your run, to your sprint mechanic, because every one of those, when we leave double foot off the floor, when we jump, we now take our body weight and we apply a force multiplier on top of it. So going back into engineering brain, you're thinking about what is gravity doing to body weight? It's accelerating it as it's coming down. And so now, however much you weigh, whenever you jump from, X height, you have a 2 or a 3 or a 4 or 5 times multiplier on your body weight coming down into your feet, into your legs. That is a force that you have to learn how to dissipate. You have to learn how to control that. So is it okay if I talk a little bit about it?
Absolutely, yeah.
So what we had discussed was running, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I said was my rule for getting somebody to run is that you're able to control your body weight in a back squat for at least 5 reps. And so I'm not talking about air squats. I'm talking about, if you're a 200-pound man, can you put 200 pounds on a barbell and squat it with control for 5 reps? If you can't do that, you're not adequately prepared to dissipate forces when you run, because running, both feet leave the ground, which means every single time my foot comes down into contact, I have a force multiplier on top of my body weight that is going to come through that. If I don't have the ability to adequately control that force coming down, I have no means by which to dissipate. And that force is now going to create a high stress environment, and I'm going to have to use non-pliable tissue in order to control it, meaning I'm going to go into ligamentous structure, I'm going to go in, whatever. I'm going to find a method in which I can control that force, and oftentimes it is compensatory in mechanism, and it's going to be problematic as I'm trying to utilize these positions. So your back squat has to be used as a means to teach somebody, how do I control force? How often do we ever run out of our heels? You shouldn't be, right? If you're sprinting, you should be midfoot to ball of your foot. If you're doing distance running, we should probably be landing somewhere in the midfoot. Your foot needs to strike directly underneath of your hip for most efficiency. So if we are looking at those capacities and we're teaching somebody to squat out of their heels, well, you have no means by which to dissipate force whenever your foot strikes the ground.
I have this conversation weekly. Best shoes.
That depends on the individual. So let me say it this way. I wear Converse for almost everything. I love my Converse.
You and I have the same mindset on this, the why behind this.
Yeah.
Why it should be a flat shoe. I despise running shoes, even for runners.
Yep.
And it's the reason you just said there, the heel striking.
Yeah. So your traditional running shoe is a 12 millimeter drop shoe. And they've found some interesting ways to work around that. I'll put this out there. I don't know, exactly what I'm not supposed to say, but I hate Hokas. I think that Hoka is the worst shoe that has ever been developed, with a handful of exceptions. And I'll go into that. But when it comes to shoes, your foot needs to act as a foot. You need to have the ability to use it as a mobile adapting lever. So it's interesting, like, coming through PT school and things like that, we learned well, this person has a highly supinated foot or a highly pronated foot. And if you're highly pronated, you need to get support so you're supinated, and vice versa. And there's some truth to that. However, there's also the way that I approach this with people is, do you have the ability to move your foot? Is it a rigid lever at this point? Like, do you have joint to joint movement? Do you have pliability across the entirety of it? If you have the ability to move the joints, that means we have the ability to control with muscular force how that foot moves, and you should be doing that. My exception to that, and that's my cue for flat shoes. I personally love Converse. They are not the best shoe for somebody's foot. I've worn them for years, and I refuse to change because I'm just turning into a grouchy old man. Vivo, I think, is what you typically wear, like Vivos or some form of a barefoot.
I have Flux wear on right now. I know you've worn the barefoot shoes in the past.
Love them for training. Yeah.
But can we go back to, so people will wear these shoes because they start to develop pain, or they see a commercial and they think that these are the best shoes. I agree with you. We have a couple members who wear Hokas, and I've asked multiple times, can you please wear another shoe? Mm-hmm. Because they are so unsafe.
They're unsafe for lifting, for sure. There's no exception, in my opinion, to that statement, that within a lifting environment, they are unsafe because you're standing on 2 inches of foam.
And so
you've created a highly, highly pliable surface that like you're basically standing on an Airex mat, right? Or what do you call it? The Bosu ball to try to squat. Like,
I always say it's like squatting on marshmallows.
Yeah, it is.
Because you can watch them. Their ankle is just doing this the whole time, and then they wonder why they get tendonitis.
Yep.
And it's because you are constantly battling for balance.
Or you lose spinal position, right? Because like if my foot doesn't have control, my next option for stability and control is my hip. So if I then compromise my hip and it has to create stability, guess what's rigid as I'm trying to squat? So the hip does not want to give because your brain is going to always prioritize control and safety. So it's going to perceive that as an uncontrolled area. So we're going to transfer that force up. So now my hip is rigid and I need my hips to be able to squat. So now I'm going to compromise my spine. So the control of the foot into the ground, the ability to transfer force from the foot to the ground and vice versa, is an extremely important skill. And to speak to the Hokas, my one exception is the individual that has no ability or a rigid fixation of the foot. And that does happen. We'll have somebody that will come through with arthritic change in the foot or genetic abnormality, that their foot is rigidly fixed. This is extremely rare. It is definitely the exception to the rule, but it does happen. And in that situation, that's where we have to work around it so that individual can stay active.
I had therapy on Tuesday, and we were discussing good therapist versus bad therapist. And he said there was a study done where they sent out a survey and they asked, how many therapists do you believe across the world are competent? And the majority of them said only 20%. But even the ones that would fall into the 80% that are not competent to perform therapy still thought that they were in the 20%.
Right.
And so going back on the shoe thing, when we talk about these, you ever seen like the WebMD memes where it's like you Google your symptoms and then you think you have cancer?
It's always cancer.
Yeah. And so, sometimes we'll say something like that, like, hey, it's it's less than 1% of these people,
yep,
but it will still get into their head of, well, I have to be that 1%. It has to be me.
I have to be the unique snowflake. That's
for
sure.
I want to follow up on that is why you should talk to the expert.
Right.
CrossFit has a stigma behind it, and you and I discussed in great depth our approach to CrossFit, and I think it aligns very closely to your approach to fitness and wellness as well.
For sure.
One of the things I run into is I'm a level 3 trainer. I have the certification behind it, but because I'm a trainer, sometimes people will argue with me when they're talking to others. And we talk about that good versus bad, and does someone truly understand the education behind it? I made the joke sometimes, like, maybe I should go back and get the PT so they'll listen. Because all the stuff that you have just said without us talking about beforehand are things that I talk about weekly, right? And so to hear it from a true expert, I mean, I've worked with you, and I struggled with shoulder pain for 3 years. Like, I couldn't wake up and put my arm over my head, and I had to come in here and warm up for 45 minutes. You fixed it in like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And that might be abnormal, or I did the homework, but after that, I said, okay, this guy's a true expert. I'm going to listen to him.
And I want to challenge one thing you said there. You said that I fixed it. I didn't fix anything. I just told you what to do, and you did it because you're an adult. Like I again, most of this stuff is truly basic, simple things. And again, I can't want it more than you do. You wanted this thing fixed. So when I said, hey, here's our pattern, here's the default. If we just shift these things, that takes care of 99% of it. Oftentimes, like, pain is a signaling process, right? It is not inert to the tissue. It is a signal, and it is sending something to your brain that is like, hey, there's a problem here. That is all pain is. It's just an alert system to say there's an issue. What we have to do with that is basically like looking at how do we reset that pain signaling so that we address this, your brain is satisfied. I tell people all the time, like 99% of my job is just playing with your nervous system.
Yeah, can we I want to cover that because I actually just went through this with an athlete this morning. They tweaked their SI joint, and when that happens, we get that quick inflammation response, but we want to override if it's true, like if it was a SI joint tweak.
Mm-hmm.
Not there, we have an assessment to make sure it's not in the disc. There's nothing there. I've had that happen 4 or 5 times over the 5 years that and the people who follow the protocol I give them,
mm-hmm.
no pain the next day.
Yep.
So can you discuss the nervous system side of it, what the brain does to us when we have a dysfunction like that?
So generally speaking, what we're talking about in that regard is our brain does not like uncontrolled movement, and it doesn't like movement positions that it doesn't recognize. And so it'll view both of those kind of in the same way. And it's very simplistic in how it responds to things, especially when it comes to the musculoskeletal system. Because muscle can only do 2 things. It can move things, and it can keep things from moving. And that's pretty much it, right? So under that context, talking about it from the view of like the SI joint, right? A lot of the time what will end up happening is that joint moves beyond what its physiological capability is in some way, whether that is, in a deep split squat position, a step up where we have to have this big reciprocation. It just gets pushed a little bit beyond what the brain perceives as controlled. And as soon as that happens, the brain's response is, oh, we got to lock it down. And so that's that quick, angry muscle spasm. And pain is going to be a secondary impact of that, because it's signaling to your brain there's something wrong that's happening, or it's the output of the brain that something wrong is happening, right? And so it's a trigger to try to keep you from doing something. And so if we can integrate back to that and say, hey, you're okay, your brain needs to know we're okay to move into this area, you're safe here, we do these couple of movement patterning things so that it basically allows your brain to relax. Like it's taking that nervous system that is freaking out because it got pushed into a position that it didn't want to be in, and letting it know that it's okay to go there. And the vast majority of time, whenever that happens, your nervous system will downregulate. There is every day we're doing stuff all the time, right? You're sitting here right now on this bench, and I just drew attention to it, so now you're going to think about it. But prior to that, we're sitting here, we've been here for 10, 20 minutes, whatever. If we don't move, that's going to start to become uncomfortable, right? But at this moment, we have air in the room, we have, light, we have everything that is happening around us that is below our threshold of consciousness. There's things that are going on, unless we bring attention to it, we're not going to think about it. So that's like this line down here. See if I can, camera. So that's our line down here, right? So everything below this line is sub-threshold of consciousness. I'm not going to think about it until I have to. And then we have signaling that will happen that brings consciousness, right? So like, oh, okay, this is above that threshold. Now I'm going to pay attention to it. And then we have this max threshold, which is our pain threshold, right? So somewhere in between here is where we roll, like when we're doing normal day-to-day activity. I'm walking, I'm hiking, I'm getting a burn in my quads. That's sub-pain threshold, but it's still noticeable. I'm still going to be aware of it. And then we have an event happen that drives us through that pain threshold. Well, as soon as that happens, that top-end threshold for pain signaling starts to come down. And our window of day-to-day activity now becomes more threatening to our system. And so our brain will perceive more things as being problematic because that threshold has now been lowered. If we can take that threshold and introduce non-noxious movement, non-painful movements, things that allow you to cycle and use those joints and those muscles in ways that are not provocative to it, we take that threshold and we push it back up slowly so that then it takes larger and larger things to drive consciousness to it.
So you said something very interesting there to me. And I've done PT at your facility before. And one of the things I loved was never did I go in there and do the same movements from month to month or however often my visits were. Always did different movements. But the interesting thing to me was I was always asked, is there any pain? And I'd be like, maybe a 2 or 3. Quit. We don't want no pain. And we would just change the movement slightly so there was no pain. And I found that very fascinating that we don't want no pain whatsoever. We can go back to increasing the movement later on.
Right.
But right now we just want to work with no pain.
And there's a time and place for all of it. There's a time when I'm going to tell you, hey, I need you to work through this pain. But we have to be very cognizant about what is that pain signaling that's happening. And what is the context that it's giving our brain so that we can best move it forward. In this situation, we've got to bring that threshold down for you because with a surgical process, it's going to set off that pain signaling because you had a major trauma. Right. Surgery is a major traumatic event, whether we want to consider that it's controlled or not. It is, but it is controlled chaos, controlled trauma to your system. And so your nervous system is going to be running up here at all times. So our job is to start off by bringing that down so that you don't have the aberrant response that we don't want, which is muscle spasm, which is protective guarding, that limits your range of motion, that limits your capacities. And then once we get that sub-threshold level of movement that we need for day-to-day activity, now we can push
it.
Right?
Yep.
The perception of pain is something that I'm very fascinated with because something him and I have discussed. We might have an athlete who comes in and they say that they're in pain and they're like, it's a 9. I'm like, what, a 9? It should feel like the limb's going to fall off. So, but he might come in and it might be a 3. And so pain is, from my understanding, it's the one health marker that they ask for in the doctor's office that is not truly measurable.
It is an individualized experience. So this is one of those things that drove me crazy for years because PT school, you're constantly taught to ask about pain thresholds or pain levels or where are you at with this. I intentionally do not, with a handful of exceptions. The reason I don't is because I can do very little to interact with pain. I can't see it. I can't touch it. I don't know what you're experiencing. So the way I take things is maybe a little bit different than what the standard is in that if you come in and you tell me I'm in a 9 out of 10 pain, I don't care what that should mean. I don't care that, maybe we should go to the hospital, whatever. I need to, you walk in and you're calm, you're not flush, you're not sweating, it's not emergent, right? You're not truly in this extreme level of pain. What you're telling me is you have a lot of pain. That's what I need to take away from it. You're in a lot of discomfort. This is some of the worst you've ever experienced. Cool. It's not my job to know what your pain level is. It is my job to appreciate where you're at and understand that you're hurting. And you want somebody to pay attention to that. Because that happens a lot, that somebody will come in and like, oh man, it's a 10 out of 10. well, cool, we're having a really calm conversation. So like, if I look at it from the standpoint of like, well, that means we got to go to the ER. Like, I'm not arguing with you. Like, you're experiencing a 10 out of 10. You're telling me this is the worst thing that you have ever experienced. Cool. What can we do? Can we move?
We're talking about the perception
Right.
of pain, right? And one of the things, what I was just taking away when you're talking about the thresholds, we increase the threshold capacity for pain by doing movements.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
because one of the things we'll discuss sometimes when we have a newer athlete and they're like, I hurt. They're using the word hurt or pain. And the question that I might have is it truly pain, or is it the muscle that you haven't used in 20 years working?
Are you hurt or are you injured?
That's a good.
Because those are two very different things, right? And you're 100% right. So like, I don't have it as often anymore, but I've worked in environments where you'll have somebody who has been extremely sedentary, you know, for the majority of their life, and they come in because they have this pain problem of some nature, and you give them a benign movement, something that we would probably not even register, right? But because they're so sedentary, they get sore. And the next thing you know, you hurt me because, you know, I've never felt this before. And it's like, okay, well, did it go away in about 24 hours? Yeah, but that really hurt. It's like, you got really sore, and that's okay. Like, you have to set an expectation with people as well. And that's a big part of what we need to be doing as practitioners, as coaches, is when you have that new person who comes in, it is our responsibility to provide them an understanding of, hey, you've never done this, so expect these things. Because if we can create an expectation, the threshold of fear is dropped significantly. So a good example of this, there was a research study done a number of years ago about pain science education. So a lot of the stuff we just talked about. And what they did was they provided a pain science education lecture to individuals who are getting a hip replacement. And then they had the control group who got no pain science education, just the standard procedure, and then into PT. The group that had the pain science education had a 60% reduction in overall reported pain scales, just because they understand what is happening within their system. And so perception, right? If I perceive that a sore muscle is an injured muscle, I am scared. It's creating fear. It's going to drive that nervous system up, right? So I'm getting into that fight or flight, which causes this unresolved sympathetic state, right? So if I'm up into that sympathetic nervous system where I'm wired, everything is now more threshold pain. It's driving that threshold down. My pain signaling is going higher because I don't understand it. But if you told me, hey, your quads are going to feel really sore after you did all those walking lunges, and the next day I wake up and my quads are sore, like, I expected that. I knew that was going to happen. So it doesn't drive the fear. It doesn't create the sympathetic state. It allows for more of that recovery to happen in a faster time frame.
That's a great point.
So we have an onboarding process, and our first workout is very simple to get the muscles moving again, to where I want them to come in with as little soreness as possible the next day. If they skip the onboarding process and they go right into group, we have some tough workouts, and sometimes people don't adjust accordingly. And so if I see that happening, I will actually go over to them and I will tell them, you are going to be sore, but if you go for a 10-minute walk this evening, it's going to reduce the amount of soreness you're going to have over the next day.
Right.
One of the other things I wanted to go back on, because you discussed it earlier with the running, if someone cannot handle that force production or the multiplier, then it starts to get into the tendons and the ligaments.
Right.
And when we're talking about pain management, someone who's been sedentary for 20 years and now their muscular system is not supporting their weight and it's falling into those tendons and ligaments, I just wanted to point that out.
Yep.
When we're looking at pain, typically it's caused because we haven't used our body to what it's necessarily needed. I mean, one of the simple things that I look at, we get a good bit of people in their 40s who have like plantar fasciitis.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been sitting behind a desk for 20 years. They're getting 2,000 to 3,000 steps a day, and your foot's designed to get 10,000 steps.
Right.
And so you're carrying that load on your foot, and we're also looking at the the weight. I mean, we adjusted our onboarding process about 2 months ago, and we just did 2 goal reviews yesterday. 2 athletes, 6 weeks, 20 pounds down.
That's awesome.
And but it's the education on the front end.
Yep.
That's what it was. We just hammer the nutrition side of it. But can we maybe talk about, if you're taking someone who has been sedentary for that extended period of time, what's the expected time frame to get their system to the point that it can support?
So that it's robust enough to be able to train, right? So that's a hard thing to say in a universal statement, right? But like, it kind of comes into, how deconditioned are we? Where are you at? And then what is your expectation as we're going through these things? So like, a 40-year-old who is sedentary now, that has a desk job and has not done a lot, that played high school football or college ball or something like that, that has some athletic background, that's a very different conversation than the 40-year-old who did not do anything through high school, did not do anything in the weight room, has never had this experience. That system has a lot of learning to do. And so, again, I use some just general rough metrics like the body weight squats, things like that. Like that, how long does it take to get somebody to squat their body weight? Like realistically, for an older sedentary individual, it could take a couple months. And then we're more apt and ready to explore some of these other things, right? Like the most basic things are satisfied. You might have somebody that walks in the door and is ready to squat, 400 pounds on day one. It doesn't happen often, but it happens. And so that system is very different than the system that is, not able to handle a barbell yet or whatever it may be.
What time do you have to be out of here by? I want to make sure. Okay.
I got lunch after this, so I'm good, man. I can talk all day if you want.
Okay, cool. I just know when you and I are going back and forth in text, we're always trying to map out stuff, and it's like, how about 3 weeks on a Tuesday? So,
oh man, yeah, it seems like that's the life of the business owner, right? Like we just never seem to line up very well. No, I always say like next week it's going to calm down.
Been saying that for 5 years.
Yeah. Nick, can you explain how your approach to PT is different than most? Because you and I were talking before, and I've shared some of my experiences with some local PT. But then when I came to your facility, you all individualize everything, and that's what I love about your place. It is very individualized, and I shared my experience. Go to different PTs around here, and it doesn't matter if you're a 16-year-old athlete, 55-year-old who's in pretty good shape, or an 88-year-old. I'm doing the same movements as these other people, whereas you all hone in. And you hit on something earlier, how, okay, I've had both knees replaced. And when I worked with one of your therapists there, I found it very interesting that the focus wasn't on the knee, and you kind of touched on this earlier. It was, oh, your ankles are pretty good. There are some limitations, but let's look at the hip.
Right.
Because that's where a lot of my issues are. And so if you could just explain that a little bit.
Yeah, and in timing is everything. So, coming fresh out of a surgery, there's a certain aspect to that we've got to deal with. We need to make sure that movement standards are satisfied for how much range are you getting and those kinds of things. Right. Like, now I say that very, very loosely because I am not a believer in protocols whatsoever. I think protocol is a Latin term that means inadequate. It is satisfying for 50% of the population. So if you're following a protocol strictly, you're leaving off the bottom 25% and the top 25% of the population, because protocols are written in a very general way. And I can say that because I've written them. When I was actually finishing my PT education, I was in a facility that was tied with an orthopedic group, and they were like, man, you're doing some really interesting stuff with return to sport. And I'm like, I didn't know I was doing anything interesting. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just shooting in the dark. And they're like, will you write our return to sport protocol? I was like, I guess so. I mean, like, this is a third-year PT student. I had no idea what I was doing. And so, like, but I've seen how these things are written. So that's my first step, is that, yes, everything is individualized, because we need to consider where you're coming into this at. What is your base level function? How are you moving today? And that's going to have a heavy impact on how we're going to progress you, and what movements we might consider. But ultimately, everything comes down to patterning. And so, we talked a little bit about like, you did different movements when you would come in, but the reason that happens is because every single time you walk through the door, we're reassessing things.
Right.
So it's not just, I take a look at you and then 6 weeks later, we're going to update your program. We're doing this in such a way that we allow attrition to occur on its own. So I don't need you to come into my clinic to allow for tissue healing to happen. That's a waste of your time. It's a waste of my time, as long as you're doing your part to things. Not that there's not exceptions to that rule, but generally I like to spread things out. I don't like to see you a ton of times right back to back to back, because it doesn't allow for tissue healing to occur. So if I give you a handful of things to work on, go practice this. It's universal movement patterning, so that it's going to carry forward into everything else that you're going to do. So whether I'm working on a hip hinge pattern, getting glutes to fire for hip extension, working on ankle motion, whatever that may be, there's a universality to it that's going to apply to the things you're already doing. And so I'm going to have you work on those things. You're going to come in and we're going to basically go through and we're going to reassess where you're at. And that's where the magic really happens, is we're going to look at your movement every single time you come through the door, rather than just saying like, okay, you did quad sets last time, we're going to do quad sets again.
Right.
Last time we did that, but you've moved beyond that. Now that quad is able to fire, so we've got to use it in an appreciable way. And again, it's playing with the nervous system. So there's a lot of movements that I'll provide to people that I use a lot. Like I think I've introduced maybe both of you guys to floating heel squats, right? Like
yes.
We're training how to utilize your foot. It's something that I use with a ton of people for a ton of different reasons. But that movement, movement little m, that's easy to say like, okay, go do this. What's hard is to take that and say movement little m, now we're going to take it and make it a big M, where it's going to apply to your entire system. And that's where the tweaking has to happen. How do we create universality off of anything that you're doing? And I firmly believe that any exercise you can come up with in your mind can be applied to treat a condition. It's how you modify it to the individual that makes it significant to that person. That's where the real magic happens. I might use 5 exercises in a day across the entire spectrum of my day, but every single one of those is coached and cued differently, because every one of those individuals is different.
And cut.
Okay. I was like, okay, I said something wrong.
Well, we are getting close to an hour. Time flies when you're having fun.
I can talk forever about pretty much nothing. I think I have a future in politics somewhere.
I think it's something that you're truly passionate about. I tend to do the same thing, and I tell people, because like we'll have people come in and they have an issue where something's causing them pain, and I'll give them a mobility protocol, and it fixes it. Like 9 times out of 10, we can fix it pretty quickly with the right assessment. Now, if I don't believe I can fix it, I'll just say this is outside of my realm, but I have someone I can recommend you to. And they're always shocked. And I said, I love movement mechanics. Mm-hmm. Like how the body is truly supposed to move is so important. And we live in a world where it's not focused on enough. I mean, the statistic on when we actually lose ankle flexion?
It's like 10 years old, 12 years old, something like that?
Second grade.
Second grade, yeah.
It's when kids start sitting in a chair, their ankles are dangling, toes are pointed towards the ground, and they're not squatting anymore.
Well, and I think it's getting better with footwear and things like that. But you see like, little girls wear these cute little toe coffins. So their foot's shoved into this hard soled thing that doesn't allow their foot to move. Little boys are wearing running shoes or basketball shoes or whatever. And it just doesn't create the opportunity for movement expression. And 100% to your point of like, kids sitting all day is a huge disservice to them. I mean, they've shown that like the best learning happens 30 minutes after vigorous exercise. So like letting these kids go out for recess and run their guts out, and then coming back in and sitting down, your little ADHD kid that's in the corner that can't pay attention to anything, all of a sudden is able to retain information.
And if we're talking about proper movements, watch a 2-year-old. I mean, my girls are 21 months. They have perfect squats.
Yep.
And they'll sit down there and they'll play on the ground for a half hour without needing to leave that squat. But what you just talked about with the shoes, I actually buy them wide toe box.
Yep.
And those are hard to find for toddlers, but I think it's important to start now rather than trying to fix later.
Right. I think the company Splay does some youth shoes. We always bought like moccasin style shoes for our girls. Now, of course, I'm not going to pretend like we don't have them in their cute little shoes occasionally and stuff like that too. But as a general rule, like I try to keep my kids in Vans, in Converse, or some type of like my daughter wears like a type of Vibram hiking shoe. She loves those things. She wears them all the time. Something to allow her foot to be a foot. And she has like a heavily pronated foot. But until she is done growing, I'm not going to interact with that. I'm going to let her figure it out. And then her strength curve is continually increasing. I mean, my oldest daughter has lifted with me or seen me lifting in the gym since she was maybe 5 years old or so. And so she has had a barbell on her back for at least 5 years. Her movement proficiency is really high. My youngest is the same story, like does it less often, but she sees it and we set that example. So, people think that kids are not ready to actually participate in these kinds of things. But the reality is that that's been disproven years ago. Like there's no harm to their growth plates. There's no harm in actually loading them and allowing them to move with weight. And it teaches them a certain level of coordination and control that you're not going to get in any other way. If you learn how to control a barbell on your back, that's a rigidity and force transfer from your shoulders to your hips to your feet that there's no other way to replicate that in outside of a work context, right? So like for kids, like why would we not want to give them the opportunity to develop their foot, to develop their hips, to learn this coordination early on? And to your point, we talk about movement almost like a loaf of bread. And pain signaling goes along with that. So if you think about like a loaf of bread, that's all of my movement options. And so as I get older and I start stacking injuries and movement restrictions and time and seated and those kinds of things, I'm taking away slices of bread, right? So I have less and less and less movement options until I get down to one. And then when that one option gets taken away because of a minor injury or I bent over to pick up my water bottle and now my back hurts. Like it's not that bending over to pick up that water bottle. Your body ran out of options for how to get there. And so our job is universally to create as many movement options as possible for somebody. If you have options on how your body can adapt and create movement patterning, you've now found the key to success for getting rid of pain conditions because you have ways of accomplishing a task. Kids have all these movement options. Let's teach them how to utilize them so that they don't lose those as they go down the road.
I think we covered a good bit of the basics. So
we meander. This is our typical conversation, though. I think that like every time you and I talk, this is how it goes. Like everything from steroids to medications to God knows what. Like we just meander around. Well, I love it.
I think we align a lot on most things, and so it helps.
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk real quick about the new facility in Fairmont and hours of operation.
What I was just going to ask. So Move Right is opening their second location in Fairmont.
Yep.
Hit us with the details.
So we're going to be at the MedBridge building, which is the former HealthPlex facility. I am starting there as of this coming Monday, which I believe is April 7th. So I'll be there about 2 days a week right now, just filling some hours until we start getting it filled in and a little bit busier. But the goal is to have that as a full-time location. It's kind of a mini version of what we have in Morgantown, but everything that will be there will allow me to practice in the exact same way. So we're going to be breaking down your movement patterns. Nothing is going to change from that standpoint. So, we're there. Anybody who is interested can call our main office for scheduling. That is 304-554-2220. Or go onto our website, moverightpt.com, and there's links directly to scheduling online. So you don't even have to talk to anybody.
Are the scheduling links updated for Fairmont?
I believe so. Yeah.
Perfect.
If they're not, they will be by Monday.
And also, the Morgantown location is about 25 minutes away, but you and I were discussing before, you have one of the best recovery centers I've ever seen, and we were discussing not a lot of people know about it or they understand the benefits behind it, but actually you're the reason that we have the sauna we have. I copied your sauna. The flow tank you have is the best flow tank. I mean, look into those things. Super beneficial, and it's just 20 minutes up the road.
Well,
so.
I was laughing because I texted you before I came over here. I was up at our new spot here in Fairmont, and I was like, oh man, it's going to take me like 10 minutes to get over there. I'm going to be late. So I text you like, hey, I'm on my way. And it was a minute and a half to get to here, or something like that. I'm really good with like my geographical locations up here, so I'll learn it, you know. Yeah, thank you guys. I appreciate you having me in. I always have so much fun with this kind of stuff, so thank you. I appreciate everybody listening to me for an hour meander around.
Appreciate the education. I found a lot of it very fascinating. I mean, when you get to talk with someone who is as passionate as you are and as educated as you are in your field, it makes listening very easy. So thank you.
I just make most stuff up. If you say it with conviction, people believe it. So
I'll cut that out.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's not put that in.
All right, guys. Thank you.
Thanks.